Well, hello everybody. Welcome back to the channel. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I want to just take an opportunity, since I didn't upload yesterday, to wish each and every one of you a happy Mother's Day. For those of you who celebrate, and for those that celebrated with their mothers, hopefully you had a great Sunday. I was actually at work yesterday throughout the afternoon and the morning, and then I didn't spend time with my mom till the evening, so if you're wondering why there wasn't an upload yesterday, that's the reason why. That sort of also leads to two programming notes that I have for each and every one of you before we get started today. First of all, my uploading schedule is going to be pretty weird and wonky over the next week and a half, 2 weeks. I'm going to try to stay as consistent as possible in doing an upload a day with our weather discussions that we do, but right now with my move coming up here in about a week and a half, things are going to be a little bit hectic in my life. So until I move and get everything packed and relocated, things are not going to be very consistent. That being said, I am going to be uploading consistently overall once I get down there. I'm trying to do an upload at least once a day and really early in the morning. I'm going to be starting a new full-time job down in South Carolina, so I'm definitely looking forward to that. I love doing this, so I'm going to try to keep uploading in the mornings and getting video content out for you guys regarding the latest weather for the lower 48 and talking about the stories that matter to you in the weather world. So that's programming note number one. So I appreciate every single one of you subscribing and staying tuned, but like I said, things are going to be kind of crazy. The second thing that I want to mention is I'm testing some things out on the channel. You notice that my YouTube Shorts, for example, I'm kind of dabbling in some different things. So you might see me, taking a YouTube Short and extrapolating it from a weather discussion that we did a couple days prior or that day, and then creating some shorts out of them. You may even see me create shorts from some viral weather content that has recently been published that I try to get that's non-copyrighted. If it is copyrighted, then I obviously would get permission for it. I'm trying to kind of dabble in a couple of things. The point is, though, this channel is Weather Minds, and we are going to stick strictly to weather. So that's not going to change, but what I'm doing is sort of dabbling with the different content that clicks with people. I may even start doing a little bit more editing on the channel. I'm actually thinking of doing so and maybe adding some more edits to these videos and making it a little bit more organized. Just kind of playing around and testing with what works and what doesn't. So that being said, let me know down in the comments below some suggestions you have for the channel. There's a lot of weather YouTubers out there, a lot more than there was 3-4 years ago, and I want to make this channel revolved around you guys. For those that are tuning in that may be looking for something a little bit different. So let me know. Let me know what advice you have, suggestions you have that we can do to improve the channel over time. Because as I've said already today and as I've said in the past, I want this YouTube channel to be just me pouring out my love for weather, communicating it in a way that makes sense to each and every one of you. And the best part about this channel too is I want to be able to teach you guys something about the weather that maybe you didn't know before you came here. So again, any suggestions that you have, any recommendations, I would greatly appreciate that because I want to make this a great experience for each and every one of you. That all said, let's get into today's video, and boy, we have a lot to talk about. And that leads to a quick story, if I may. I love my diatribes. You guys are so patient with me, but just one story for you, because I hear this so often in meteorology, is like the worst thing you could ever say as a forecaster is that there's nothing going on. I remember when I was doing a class here at my college that I went to for meteorology, there was actually a group during forecast discussions that said, hey, there's nothing going on in the lower 48. And my professor lost his mind. He's like, don't you ever say that there's nothing going on. There is always something going on in weather. And that has always stuck to me to this day. So even though that I say there's a lot going on today, just know that there always is something happening in the world of weather. There's always some storyline to talk about. But we do have quite a bit to talk about today. So I'm going to try to divide this into two faucets, and this isn't going to be an edited video, although, like I said, I am going to start doing that more in the future and making some bookmarks for you guys so that way you can follow along. But we're going to try to break this discussion up into two parts. The first one that I want to focus on right away is actually the flash flooding threat, which is going to exist today across two areas. The first one, and probably the biggest concern area, is going to be from the Florida Panhandle all the way through the deep south for Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And as soon as I say that, I mean, look, we have a large training of showers and thunderstorms moving through the Panhandle right now. That's going to continue to be the theme throughout the day today, and especially going into tonight. But there also is a second area of flash flooding that I don't think really is getting talked about enough just because it's sort of under the radar, but it's actually going to be for northern Illinois. We have this surface low pressure system spinning out near Kansas City as of this morning. That's going to continue to move off towards the east, and as it does so, it's going to move pretty slow. So whenever you have a low pressure system that slows down, sort of spinning right over the same area, you tend to get some training convection over the same locations and localities. That's exactly what we're expecting here for this afternoon into tonight for northern Illinois. We could see rainfall in that area within a couple of inches. But for the Gulf, what we're going to see is also rainfall exceeding like 5+ inches over the next 24 hours. So we'll talk about the flooding threat first, but then we also have a severe weather threat for today as well. Sadly, it's actually over the same areas that we're expecting flash flooding for, and that's going to be for the Gulf. So we do have an enhanced risk for severe weather. This encompasses the Panhandle all the way back towards Texas. And I forgot to mention, and an honorable mention, is that we have supercells firing off the higher elevations of Mexico there. And so that is going to be the area of concern moving forward, as we are anticipating those clusters of supercells out near the international border between Mexico and Texas, the United States, eventually converging into an MCS large complex of storms as they move eastward into the Gulf. That's exactly why we are anticipating an enhanced risk for severe weather. Main threats out of that, as we're going to find, is going to be damaging winds as well as some hail. We could even see the possibility of some tornadoes as well later on this afternoon into the evening. So, as I mentioned, we're going to start first here with the flooding, because that is definitely a main storyline. But I promise you we're also going to talk here about the severe weather and really break that down. So if you do enjoy today's video, be sure to like and subscribe, share with family and friends who will be impacted by these events today. And with that being said, let's get into today's video. So I'm going to take this overlay off here. And what I want to show you first is just the overall pattern. Because remember, in meteorology, guys, we want to talk about the top down. What I mean by the top down is we want to look at our upper level and mid-level jet, and then we want to work our way down closer to the surface. So let's start first here with our 500 millibar overlay. Again, this is courtesy of the College of DuPage. And so as you can see, we have this, I would call it not a closed low, but more of a cutoff trough. So it might be sort of hard to see. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw this out for you guys. But this is our 500 millibar jet that's highlighted here in these red lines. Our 500 millibar jet would be our jet stream, okay? Now, what we're seeing here is what's called split flow. Split flow essentially means that we have two jet streams. Jet stream number one is this polar jet, and as you could suspect, it comes from the poles and it moves equatorward. And then you have a secondary jet, which is your Pacific jet. So two jet streams. I think a lot of times, one of the things that I notice whenever I talk to folks that, follow the weather religiously, maybe not academically from a degree point of view, but just, follow the weather, I think there's this false assumption that there's only one jet stream, and that's it. There's not. There can be multiple jet streams at once. In this case, we do. We actually have a couple. So what's happening here is our polar jet, number one, and our Pacific jet, number two, are going through what's called this coupling. Coupling just means that both jet streams are converging at a point. Where that's happening is actually where this upper level ridge is, which is out towards the Ohio Valley as well as the eastern United States. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw that here in yellow. And there's our ridge. There we go. Now as a reminder, upper level ridges are associated with higher pressure. Okay. So what's happening here is we're getting this jet coupling right in the location where we're seeing most of the rainfall this morning, and that's near the Gulf. This whole area is where we're seeing this jet coupling. Now, it's not a perfect jet coupling because you notice that these jet streams are pretty much running almost parallel to one another, but you do, again, have this cutoff low that's in between the two jet streams. So there's important factors to everything I just said. I mentioned just now this cutoff low. Why that's important is because when you have a low pressure that's cut off from the main jet flow, whether it be the polar jet or your subtropical jet, that means your low pressure is going to have a much tougher time in moving eastward. It's actually going to move a lot slower because there's nothing really pushing it except itself, right? Its own kind of relative winds is what's moving it along, and its occlusion and its development. So that's why we're actually expecting that flash flooding threat later on today for northern Illinois. That's pretty much why. It's because this low pressure is essentially cut off from both jet streams, and it's going to move really slow. And when you have a low pressure that sits over the same area for a long period of time, that can lead to flooding concerns. This is also an area, by the way, in northern Illinois and much of the lower Great Lakes that is actually pretty saturated right now. We've seen quite a bit of rain. We're not dealing with drought, and a lot of our rivers are really high. So that can actually lead to even creek flooding as well as river flooding concerns too. For folks, again, in Illinois, I'll even get more specific, the Fox River Valley, the Illinois River Valley, you definitely want to be keeping an eye on the forecast for the latest information on that, because we could certainly be talking about some elevated river rise concerns. Now, that's covering really the northern Illinois threat. That doesn't really cover the Gulf. It does to a degree, but what's actually happening in the Gulf here with your flooding threat is that jet coupling that we talked about, but it's also at the surface too. So if we take a look at our boundaries, you will notice on our surface maps here that we have this convergent boundary that's across the Gulf. Now, remember from our conversations before, convergent boundaries are really important to forecast for, because in that case, we're talking about cold air that moves equatorward, or from north to south, converging with warmer air at the Gulf. And when you have that continuous convergence with a stationary convergent boundary, which is not really moving much, hence the name stationary, that leads to training of thunderstorms over a period of time. And especially because we're talking about the Gulf and we're talking about relatively modest convection, if we're seeing really heavy thunderstorms just over and over and over again, that can lead to much higher rainfall rates and subsequently much higher rainfall totals than what we're likely to even see in the other flooding concern today for northern Illinois. So that's certainly a huge concern here. The other thing that's really worrying to me is that not only do we have this convergent boundary that is quasi-stationary, but our precipitable water values today across this region, which you're going to see on some soundings here later on, is anywhere between 1.95 and 2 inches. That is really high. So we're talking about a heavily saturated environment, over 2 inches of precipitable water in some spots. That is certainly going to lead to some elevated flooding concerns for today. So those are the two areas that we're going to be worried about. We will kind of wrap everything up in this discussion by looking at the models once we go through our severe weather discussion. But one thing that I did forget to show as I leave all of these tabs up that have nothing to do with it. All right. One thing I forgot to show is what the Weather Prediction Center is forecasting for. So this kind of recaps everything we talked about, but this is the latest outlook from the Weather Prediction Center on the flooding risk. We do have a slight risk for flooding from northern Illinois all the way back towards Missouri and Iowa. I forgot to mention you guys in northern Missouri and south central Iowa, but same thing applies to you. We got a very slow low pressure system, cut off low, moving off to the north and east. So that's going to certainly lead to some flooding concerns there, highlighted in the yellow. But then we also have a moderate risk for flooding in areas of the Gulf, especially near the Panhandle, where, as we just talked about, we have this convergent quasi-stationary boundary that's set up right where this moderate risk is situated, and that's going to lead to continuous training of showers and thunderstorms over the same areas. I mentioned about drought earlier for northern Illinois. Remember how I just talked about how northern Illinois doesn't have a drought right now and things are pretty saturated? Same thing goes for the Gulf. I mean, for you guys in the Gulf last year, what a difference does that make? I mean, we were talking last year in the summer about some exceptional drought over the same areas that are getting hit hard with rain today. Now, we have very little drought to talk about. As a matter of fact, we've actually had too much rain over the last few months. And a lot of that can be attributed to El Nino because El Nino does tend to favor that Pacific jet we talked about. It's exactly what we're seeing here today and what we're actually expected to see over the next few days. If you think that this is the last system for you folks in the Gulf, it's not. We actually are anticipating another system moving through the region later on this week that's going to probably also bring another round of showers and thunderstorms and maybe even the threat for severe weather as well. So that really takes care of the flooding concerns and really kind of highlights that discussion. I guess the one thing that I do want to show you guys is the QPF forecast. And this is the precipitation forecast for much of the region. This is over a period of 120 hours, so let's actually go to 72 and look where we're expecting the most rain. We could be talking anywhere between 5 to 7 inches of rainfall right near the panhandles of both Alabama and Florida, pretty much highlighting where that moderate risk for heavy rainfall and flooding is forecasted for. But then we also have another sort of area of about 1 inch or 2 up towards northern Illinois. Now, the northern Illinois threat, I think, is going to be over the period of a couple of days. I expect actually these numbers to be a little bit higher, but I think general range of about 1 to 3 inches of rain for northern Illinois and southern Iowa, northern Missouri. I think that's pretty plausible. We're not going to be talking about really robust convection like we are in the Gulf, and for the most part, it's not. It's going to be rather light to moderate precipitation. Not expecting anything as high as what we're going to see out towards the south and the southeast. So now that really covers the rainfall threat and the flooding threat for today. Let's now move forward though to the severe weather threat. The enhanced risk that we have, which is for today across literally the same areas that we just talked about earlier, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Texas. This is actually for a separate threat than the flooding. We're going to be talking about some robust convection later on this afternoon into this evening. And so we'll take a look here at the TOR threat. We do have a 5% tornado threat for today for literally the same areas under a moderate for flooding. Florida Panhandle, Alabama Panhandle, Mississippi, and Louisiana. So 5% TOR later on for this afternoon into the evening. Looking at the hail threat, should be rather minimal with the exception of Texas with some of those supercells that are firing off this morning. We have some pretty steep lapse rates in that area, definitely expecting some significant hail. But then once we move east to Louisiana with time, you notice that the hail threat certainly drops off to about 2% over what would be Georgia as well as Jacksonville. But then look at the wind threat, guys. I'm expecting this to be rather high. And it certainly is. 30% SIG for damaging straight line winds over the same area. We are anticipating that an MCS fires off this afternoon into this evening. And remember, these MCSs can bring really strong winds, and their structure supports it. Typically in the form of a bow echo. You got cold air that's rushing forward, and that can bring some damaging straight line winds. Now you're probably wondering, well, Brennan, what's the culprit of that? How are we going to end up getting these storms? I mean, if we're seeing all this training convection today already, how are we going to have an unstable atmosphere to produce what would be a pretty strong straight line wind event? Well, here's how that's going to happen. So if we go back here to our radar, we actually have these supercells that we talked about earlier firing off near Texas. These cells are in a really nice environment for essentially clustering. What I mean by that, as you notice here on reflectivity, remember how we just had a supercell here? Well, now look how quickly this has grown up scale and clustered. As a result of that, what's happening is you have a lot of moisture advection being fed into these storms. You also have some dry air entrainment aloft coming off the higher elevations of Mexico. And so what happens with that is if you have, and follow me for a second, I'm going to get a little geeky with you guys here. If you have moisture advection in the boundary layer, really saturated moisture advection, coupled with dry air entrainment above the boundary layer, you can actually promote downdraft creation, right? Remember that downdraft says air that's rushing down towards the surface and rushes forward once it hits the ground. It's going to be because the combination of both deep moisture advection at the boundary layer, as well as dry air entrainment, meaning dry air in the mid-levels being fed into these storms, that is going to essentially lead to a lot of negative buoyancy closer to the surface. As a result, that negative buoyancy promotes rapid upscale growth of convection and a lot of cold pooling and basically a creation of a larger MCS. It's exactly what we're expecting here today. We're kind of seeing that right now because, as I just mentioned, we have a crap load of clustering taking place. You notice that these cells really aren't, holding their supercell characteristic together. Let's actually zoom in for a second and dissect this a little bit more because this really is going to be the catalyst for today. We're going to pick a radar closer to it. And so let's take a look here. This is as of this morning. You notice that these cells, if we kind of slow down a second here, they tried to go supercell, but notice how they're merging right away. We're not seeing a lot of discrete activity. We did originally. We got a little bit up towards the north and west of this radar site here at Laughlin. But if you look towards the southeast, all these cells, 1, 2, 3, 4, they're all converging on each other. And that's because we have a crap ton of negative buoyancy we're dealing with. This is going to create supercells, clustered, embedded supercells that will have the opportunity to produce hail as they move downstream here later on today. But once we get into Louisiana and really towards the Gulf later on this evening, this is eventually going to be just one big line of strong thunderstorms. And that's why our tornado potential, as well as even the hail potential, does slightly decrease over time. But that's exactly what's happening right now. Again, you can see it here on radar. This is such a cool loop, courtesy of College DuPage. Got a lot of cell mergers going on this morning. You can actually see, too, if you really make it out, you even have some of your outflow boundaries slamming into nearby cells. It's really hard to see, but you can actually notice it happening right then and there. And even towards the end of this, you get this cell convergence that creates all this clustering going on. A lot of boundary interaction, a lot of negative buoyancy we're dealing with, and a really saturated environment is going to be the perfect, essentially, I wouldn't say environment because I've already said environment, but it is going to create the perfect recipe for a significant wind event later on today. The other point, though, that I wanted to bring up, because I guess it doesn't really answer the main question that I asked, which was, if we're getting all of this rain, why is it that we are going to have the atmosphere recover? How does the environment recover? If we're seeing all these storms throughout the Gulf, how the hell is this going to uptrend and strengthen over time? We just talked about negative buoyancy, right? Negative buoyancy can be created by a process called evaporative cooling. If we're seeing storms over the same areas over time, well, that's going to stabilize your boundary layer for a bit. But it also does, in a way, create a little bit more of stability at the surface, that high pressure. But if we have a lot of negative buoyancy we're working with, that actually creates a better environment for a derecho event. Not saying that this will be a derecho, but it certainly creates the best environment for it. So that's why, despite the fact that we're seeing all these showers and thunderstorms across the Gulf this afternoon and this morning, that doesn't mean that we're done, because this convergent boundary that's placed right in the area here highlighted in yellow, it's not moving anywhere. It's not really going to be moving north. If anything, it might move a little bit further south. And so these storms are going to ride that convergent boundary. They're going to have plenty of instability to work with. And subsequently, they're going to eventually grow upscale. There's model confidence that's very high in that idea. So let's take one last look here. We'll look at Cape, and we'll see what the current environment looks like. And we're talking about right now, these storms out here near Texas that are just continuing to upscale rapidly. 4,000 surface Cape at the moment. And if we were to look at mixed layer Cape and dissect that, we're talking around the same amount, around 3,800 to 4,000 joules per kilogram. A lot of instability to work with here in this area. So before we hop into models, I just want to take a quick look here at the SPC. Forgot to open up that tab, so we'll go ahead and go to mesoanalysis. And just want to look at the current environment as is and take this just a step further. So one thing I want to look at is two things. Number one, I want to look at the kinematics, and I also want to look at the therms. So here is our bulk shear. Boy, do we have a lot to work with. 50 to 60 knots. You guys can't see that. 50 to 60 knots of bulk shear in this area as of this morning. That's wonderful. That's great. If you're a storm, you love any relatively high magnitude of shear to work with, okay? Surface-based CAPE, as we talked about, 4 to 4,500 in this area. As you can tell, the cap is pretty much eroded just to the east there near the Air Force Base and just to the west of San Antonio. And then the other thing I wanted to show you too is what's also really important here, and that's our HODOs. One thing to note about the hodographs today, they are not veering. As a matter of fact, a lot of our veering right now is happening here in the Gulf. We don't have much veering at the moment, and throughout the day today, we do get some low-level veering, but the big story, though, is that our hodographs, look how long they are. You see that green and yellow there? Those are vectors that are highlighting our mid and upper level shear. When they're really elongated like that, when you stretch it out kind of like a slinky, right? That means that our winds are really strong. We have really strong winds aloft. And so because of that, that can subsequently lead to, promotion of severe weather. If we have really strong winds aloft, that means that our forcing's really good. And if we're trying to forecast for a damaging straight line wind event as the primary hazard for today, seeing these elongated HODOs is a telltale sign. We already talked about the idea of dry air entrainment. We also talked about negative buoyancy. That's because of evaporative cooling in the boundary layer. But also, you have elongated HODOs. This is a perfect recipe for a wind threat, hence why the SPC issued a 30% SIG for today across the Gulf. So if we go forward in time, though, back to the map, you can see that these cells continue to move off towards the east. I'll show you guys a better model rendition of that here in a moment so you can see it a lot clearer. But we are anticipating these storms clustering and then moving off towards the east. I don't know why I can't talk today. It's probably because I'm still waking up. But the other thing I wanted to highlight too is the precipitable water, 1.9 to 2 inches. We're already seeing across Texas and the Gulf. Also, though, besides the precipitable water, because we're talking about downdrafts, let's take a look at the DCAT. Oh my goodness, look at that DCAT. Anywhere between 1,200 to 1,300 joules per kilogram. That's really stinking high. Okay, really stinking high. We are certainly anticipating downdrafts today. We've already talked about why, but clearly our DCAT also supports that too. So let's finally take a look at weather models, or good old weather models, as we always like to look at. And we're going to head on over to the great website of Pivotal Weather for exactly that. So let me go ahead and zoom in, and we'll go to our models. And I'm going to pull just a couple real quick, and I want to highlight both regions. So the Midwest we talked about, as well as the Gulf. We're going to start first here with a rapid refresh, which is updating its 12Z. Let's just go to 6Z, just for the sake of time here. And I'm going to first start by zooming in on the Midwest. So we do have that surface low moving through, that cutoff low we keep talking about. And look at how slow this thing moves. It drags, folks. Storms and cells and rain and rain and rain. And by the way, that starts, if you want to know timing, later on tonight, 23Z. It's right around 6, 7 o'clock p.m. this evening for you folks here in Northern Illinois, Iowa, and Missouri. And as I just mentioned, that's going to continue to just spin and churn over the next 24 to close to 36 hours before it eventually moves out of here by Wednesday morning. So about 1 to 3 inches we are anticipating. Let's still verify that by taking a look here at the latest rainfall totals. And you can see, at least from the RFS point of view, it's spitting out anywhere between about 1 to 3 inches, right? So generally within the range that we've been talking about. And also if we look here at the HRRR and we take the 12Z from that, we can see that the rainfall is likely going to be somewhere within that ballpark, although the placement is a little bit further south along central Illinois, Iowa, and Missouri. So model guidance on that's a little bit inconsistent on where that low sets up. It's going to be somewhere within the broader region of the lower Great Lakes. Either way, not everybody is going to see the flooding concerns. There are going to be some of you that only get maybe a half of an inch depending on where that low sets up, while others, as we just talked about, could see anywhere between 1 to 3 inches. Let's now head down to the Gulf. That's our other area of concern for today that we've been talking about during today's video. We are anticipating seeing even more elevated flooding concerns for you guys as well. And so we'll take a look here at the latest reflectivity map, and we'll zoom in for you guys so you can see us a little bit clearer. But I will start first with Texas. You see those storms that had fired off that we've been talking about? Well, the ARRR picks those up, and look what it does. It creates one long line of showers and thunderstorms. The biggest question mark that I forgot to mention, though, is where that bowing sets up. That's going to be the area concentrated with the strongest winds. If it's further off the coast, then the concern is going to be for folks that are in their wooden paddle boats outside of the shoreline, or those that are on cargo ships. But if this moves slightly north, we could be talking about more of an inland threat. But at least from the ARRR point of view, it wants to take it further south into places like New Orleans and towards sort of off the shore of the Panhandle. It remains to be seen how this all plays out, but there certainly does present the risk of the strongest winds being in the area circled here in black. But then if we look at now the precipitation, that's the other concern we've been talking about during today's video. Look at that, folks. It's sort of off the page here, but if we were to take this back towards the Gulf, we're talking about anywhere between 5 to 8 inches of rainfall in this area highlighted in black. The same can be said about our other convective models. We'll just look here at one of them, the RFS, and we'll even go to 6Z. 6Z should show us pretty much the exact same thing, and sure enough, it does. 5 to 8 inches for the Panhandle. That's going to be the biggest concern today for flooding. So, just to recap, we got severe weather for the Gulf today. Damaging winds looks to be the primary hazard, but you certainly can't rule out tornadoes as well as some large hail. The larger hail and tornado threat is going to be back towards eastern Texas, however. And then we also have a secondary flooding threat, not severe, for the Midwest, particularly the lower Great Lakes from northern Illinois and then as far westward as northern Missouri and southern Iowa. We're looking at a broader rainfall total range there of about 1 to 3 inches, certainly not as much as the Gulf, but considering the fact that we do have a lot of saturation in this region of the Midwest, there could be a lot of ponding, a lot of runoff, and could also increase water levels in some of our rivers, and we certainly don't need that in a lot of spots here in the lower Great Lakes. So thank you all so much for tuning in. Greatly appreciate all of your support. Be sure to like and subscribe, share with family and friends, and we'll be back here tomorrow on the next weather video. Take care.